All right, so we'll go ahead and get started now. So again, just to introduce the topic of this session today, and this is really going to be part of a longer series that we're trying to do that's really helping people reframe what UiPath is as a solution. So a lot of people know them as an RPA platform first. There's a lot of expanded capabilities that, especially with new improvements in some of these frontier language models that are bringing a lot of new possibilities into um, the things that we can do with the UiPath platform. So we really want to focus on not just capabilities, but diving into specific challenges and problems that might not have been possible with the previous tool sets and everything. So that's kind of the aim at this whole series. So we'll be sending out some additional series that focus on other topics. But again, we wanted to really focus on the problem itself and not necessarily just the capabilities. So as an introduction of what we'll cover, so the problem we're going to focus on today is dealing with long-running conversations and how we can orchestrate those. So it's something that traditionally RPA struggles with, and we'll kind of talk about why. We'll go into a variety of different situations of where this challenge shows up. We tried to highlight some functions that might be applicable to various different industries. So it's not focused just on one industry, but within your business, where might you find some of these challenges? But I think as we talk about these things, you should be able to identify, okay, where does this apply to my specific industry? Are there specific challenges that we face that we think we could solve with a solution like this? We'll do a brief introduction on the Maestro product itself. So understanding what is it, how does it work, how it's differentiated from other tools in the marketplace. And then we're going to jump into a live demo. So we're going to lay out a situation. It's going to be an order entry process. We're going to talk about how it's done today, and then how we would architect the solution, and then actually dive in to build it out. And then you guys can see how it runs. And then we'll kind of wrap it up with, how do you spot these opportunities within your own organization? And then any questions that you guys have at the end. So again, if you have any questions, pop them in the Q&A, or you can pop them in the chat. We'll try to get to them throughout the presentation. And we love questions and want to make it interactive if you have anything for us. So we'll go ahead and dive in. So again, naming the problem. So what do we call this kind of process? And this is where the bot has to stop and ask a question, wait for a human reply. And so the challenge with this in the traditional RPA space is there's an assumption that when we build a traditional RPA workflow is that we kind of have all the information that we need in order to execute the transaction or the process in its entirety. So the big issue is a huge percentage of real business problems don't work like that. So we see this start, bot kicks off the work. We hit this wall of saying, hey, we need more clarity on this information, or there's just things that are missing that prevent us too. So this is where we would generally utilize a human in the loop task, and you can suspend a job. You're waiting minutes, hours, days before someone has to reach out and continue that process, and then kind of pick up where we can. So it's really an inconvenience to the RPA process. And so we want to look at how do we identify these types of patterns, and then how do we solve them? So we call this conversational orchestration. So it's a long-running workflow because the process itself can span for hours or days waiting on some sort of external event. A lot of times there's this human in the loop element that requires a participant within the workflow. So we kind of talk about like the cost of context switching and how do we incorporate that in ROI returns of like an RPA process. But that's a big deal, because by the time that you get a response to something in this sort of conversation orchestration process, you might be in something else that you have to disengage from. So there is that cost there. There's sort of this asynchronous orchestration component to it, so the bot doesn't block, it doesn't suspend and resume on events, so that makes for some difficulty. And then last is we can really model this with a BPMN style workflow. So we have wait states, gateways, and parallel branches that we can all execute to, um, execute these types of problems. So this is, again, sort of the term for this classification of problems we're calling conversational orchestration. So we kind of talked about a few of these already, but why traditional RPA breaks here? So first and foremost, state management. So a classic UiPath job is very short-lived. So it's holding context for a couple days, and it's not really what an unattended bot was built for, right? So you have in an unattended execution, you want end-to-end processing. You don't want to have these long interruptions. Um, the second part of the process that is really challenging, and it's Maestro actually has a very unique solution to this problem, is triggering on the right reply. So like, how do you create that connectivity from the initial response or the initial trigger of the interaction to any replies down the chain, and making sure that everything's sort of tied together and it's not starting a brand new process. Um, and then another great thing about this tool is we can layer in agents. So the Maestro process is really a combination of agents, workflows, triggers, human in the loop elements, applications, but leveraging the ability to leverage agents within these orchestration processes allows us to take free text and translate that into something that's usable. So I think if you look at how we would solve some of these challenges in the sort of pre-AI world, is we would try to do that through like input standardization. So creating either templated files that people are supposed to fill out. Now we know, when we give a template to someone, they don't always use it the right way, and so there's still issues on how those things get processed. There's exceptions, business rule exceptions that need to be handled outside of it. So having the ability to sort of meet your customer, whether it's external or internal, where they're at, and allowing them to sort of submit requests and whatnot in a way that they're already comfortable doing is a huge advantage to not having to build that external structure. And then again, the visibility into stalled work, that's kind of a big issue, is how do we understand where these long orchestration processes are in the life cycle? Because we don't want to lose track of a task that we need to complete. A lot of these are high value tasks that are important to either revenue, compliance, or other facets of the business. So having that visibility and understanding what work has been completed, what work is in which state. So these are all challenges that traditional RPA struggles with, which were kind of unlocked with this mix of Maestro agentic automation processing. So now we're going to go into where this shows up. So it appears nearly in every business function, and we see these common patterns throughout. And again, so 80% of business processes, fit into this deterministic path, so that it can process from A to D without ever having to stop. But this missing conversational piece is what breaks a lot of these processes. And so, how do we get from, being able to automate a part of a higher level business process to the entire end-to-end solution? And that's really where this conversational component comes in. So I'll read off a couple of these, and again, we'll send out the recording if you want to view this and kind of understand, okay, where do these processes fit within my business? But in finance and accounting, obviously one common one is invoice processing. So, as we're trying to do some sort of three-way match on a process, we're missing, important information, line item mismatch, address changes, no PO. Expense reporting is a big one, and obviously a lot of applications handle this, but like someone submits a receipt, it's categorized wrong, or there's policy issues. Maybe you need clarification to understand there's some, wiggle room in the expense policy, and someone needs to explain something before it's approved or whatnot. So those are those conversations that take place outside. Collections is a big one. We also have vendor onboarding. So anywhere we're required to collect information from a customer. Again, the old way was, how do we structure this in a way where they can't miss fields, they can't provide bad information, but inevitably it always happens no matter, what sort of inputs that you use. The example, so now we kind of look at sales and customer ops, and the example that we're going to work through today is the order entry. So, we have someone sends an email in, they're a regular buyer, and they say, send me 20 of the usual, or maybe they're, quoting their product code versus your internal code. So someone has to go look it up. They might be unclear about things and how that actually aligns. So there's a conversation that has to happen there. We've got returns, so no order number or reason provided. We have to reach out. Contract red lines, so interpretation of different statements in these contracts. So those are kind of a lot of different opportunities within finance and accounting, sales and customer ops. Same things exist within HR and people operations. So we see a lot of onboarding processes. And this is a big one where we'll automate a segment of it with RPA once we collect all the information needed, but that's generally a smaller portion of the time that's dedicated to the actual whole onboarding process. It's making sure we get the proper documentation. Is it in the right format? Is there making sure that information's not there? Again, background checks and exceptions is another common one. So discrepancies and clarifications that candidates need to provide. How do we handle that communication back and forth? And we've got supply chain operations, so inventory discrepancies. So if you're having to interface between the warehouse team and understand why there's mismatches in the cycle count, getting explanations for those so that we can, take that information, not only input it somewhere, but structure it, get it in a way that's consumable by whatever downstream system. And then I think lastly, we've got IT security and legal compliance. So incident triage is a good one. So like understanding, what's occurred, who's been impacted, collecting that information by soliciting responses from various people. And then legal and compliance, obviously, NDA processing. So that's a big one, especially if you're looking at let's say like a sales process where you have to have an NDA in place before you can have certain conversations. It can slow down your sales cycle by, not getting that process, and having that sort of back and forth communications allows to, expedite some of these ways. So again, they're all over the place. I think this is such a common category of automation solutions that we can put out there that's just really why we wanted to focus on these opportunities, because it's just so pervasive in all industries and in all facets of the business. All right, so we'll dive into the technology now and kind of talk about how UiPath Maestro solves this problem, how it works, and sort of how it's a different category of some of the other tools out there. So if you talk about what is Maestro in one sentence, it's an orchestration layer that lets you model long-running processes, leveraging BPMN diagrams, which is not a UiPath standard. Obviously, it's sort of a language that all businesses kind of understand, and allows them to execute across all different capabilities within the platform. And I think this is the big thing for us, is that you see a lot of other agentic automation platforms out there, but they don't have the main capability of incorporating RPA automations natively within these workflows. So Maestro really gives you an opportunity to leverage agents that you build both within and without or outside of UiPath. Obviously, the RPA robots that everyone's familiar with, human in the loop tasks leveraging Action Center or any sort of coded apps that you might have built, and then external systems. And then I think the biggest thing is the state management that's built into the platform itself, and we'll dive in and kind of show you what that looks like. And they have some really cool representations of, okay, here's the process, here's where your bottlenecks are, here's each process, or here's each segment of the process, how long it takes. So there's really interesting analytics built into the Maestro process, so that it's, you build the initial build and there might be enhancements that you can layer in there. So whether it's additional agents, tools, context grounding to make each step of the process more efficient. It's really an amazing tool to kind of see that. And so Maestro truly is the conductor for the rest of the stack within the UiPath platform. So another reason why we really like the tool is it's built on sort of open standards. So it's not proprietary notation that UiPath uses specifically that won't translate in other elements. It's already something that someone understands. So again, BPMN, if you're not familiar, is a visual language for modeling process flows. We have steps, gateways, wait states, resume signals, sub-processes, call activities, all that kind of stuff. So it's a language that most everyone already speaks, and it's easy to understand and see when you look at the actual process flow models. So it's a great tool. So if we talk about how the conversational orchestration loop works, so in this example, we talk about some sort of trigger. So in the example that we'll build out, it's related to order entry and an email coming in. But this could be a webhook fire. It could be a record lands in either an orchestrator queue within UiPath. Obviously, UiPath has integration services with some of the largest SaaS platforms. So if you're looking at it in terms of a sales context, it could be a new lead comes into Salesforce. That could trigger the automation. Or if you're looking at something like ServiceNow for service tickets, how do we handle this kind of stuff? So in the end, you can define, there's sort of like prepackaged triggers that you can define with integrations, but then you can also build out custom triggers to initiate any of these flows. So you have an initial automation. So either you're using robots or AI agents to basically collect data, extract data, attempt to do whatever task that you're trying to do. And then this is where the first decision gateway comes in and says, hey, do you have everything you need? Can you do what you're trying to do? And if the answer is no, we can say, okay, let's put this into an action center task. Or what we're trying here is set up a email task, or if it's internal, you could use Teams or Slack to reach out to whoever you need this information to. And this is where we can put the process in a suspended state, where Maestro sits and waits for this specific event to occur. Now, you can have multiple parallel events. Sorry, Justin, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, we had our first question come in. So
Sure.
When you put an AI agent, a robot, and a human kind of in the same workflow,
Mm-hmm.
who's actually in control? And I guess the real question is, how do you keep, the AI from going off the rails on something that matters?
Yeah, I mean, as far as like, you can put guardrails in terms of what you want the specific agents to do. So each agent should be really focused on a singular task, and we'll kind of show that when we build out the order entry automation. Is like, hey, here's what it can do, here's what you're in charge of doing. And then when you have human in the loop, it's the same thing. It's like they're responsible for a certain task within the process. And so they might be responsible for an approval or providing additional information that depending on where you put it in the process would either gate things from happening or not. So, it's by providing like the Maestro structure, it's the same way that you're providing in a, an RPA workflow, is that the flow is only going to do the things that you've asked it to do. and only have the capabilities that you provide it to have.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. So I think we're at step 5 here. So talking about Maestro and the ability to wait for events. So one thing with the licensing, this is a crucial piece, is that you're not sitting there occupying a robot license, and it's able to redeploy to another process that's running. So you basically have a suspended state, but it's listening for these activities. And you can have like a wait that looks at several different events and says, okay, depending on which of these events happens first, then we will execute that specific path. So in the order entry process that we're going to look at, there's going to be 2 different elements to the wait component. Is one, we get a response from a person that would then allow us to continue the flow, or a certain period of time elapses, which then tells us, hey, we have the automation going, but someone needs to pick up a phone and make a phone call about this, because we're still not getting what we need, and we still need to resolve this. So there's various different waits and how you can configure them. And then as soon as that element, or that sort of secondary trigger to this process comes in, then it'll resume and sort of route down the flow that you've defined. And then obviously you can reevaluate the situation after you get a response and say, hey, am I in a state where I have everything that I need to do downstream processing? Or do we still need to ask more questions? So you can kind of loop back, define how many iterations of the loop before you ultimately determine that something is completed. Cool. So when we talk about the things that really matter for this kind of work, I think the 3 things that we want to focus on is a durable state. So everything starts and stops in a reliable manner that you can observe. You can see every iteration of the trigger that comes in. So you can see where everything's at in the process. You can evaluate, the decisions that were made throughout, as well as like the data that came in that was used. And then that we're, again, elevating the humans in the process. So where we do need approvals, we can incorporate human in the loop, where they're sort of bolted into the existing process, the existing flow, and it's not some add-on that we have to build outside of the Maestro flow. And then it gives us end-to-end visibility. And so from an audit perspective, this is fantastic. So you can see exactly what happened in the process. You can see advanced analytics on how long each process part of the process is taking. And it sort of feeds into process mining to kind of understand those different elements. Cool. Anyone have any questions before we kind of dive into the example and start building some stuff?
Just gonna say, feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you.
Awesome. Okay, so I mentioned a couple times throughout that the process that we're going to be looking at today and building out is the email triggered order entry. So if we take a look at what it looks like today, it's an email comes in from the customer requesting a new order. So you would have a person review this and say, do we have enough information in this to process the order? And they might have to do some matching of product codes and whatnot, some clarification of pricing, stuff like that. If it's incomplete, that's when they're going to have to send out an email requesting more details from the customer. And then they would have to, throughout their workday, either wait, recheck, reach out with an additional response, and kind of loop through this process before they can come back in and say, okay, we're good to go. We can enter this. So if we take a look at how does that look today with Maestro and UiPath. So we break down into different components here that leverage different parts of the UiPath stack. So first we have an email trigger, which is monitoring a specific email inbox. And this provides integrations with a lot of the big tools. So today we're going to use an integration with Gmail to test that out. A classifier agent. So a lot of people are using shared mailboxes um, for these types of problems where you might get, marketing emails. There might be emails related to other actions that need to be taken. So having a classifier agent on the front to say, is this a customer order or is this something else? So it kind of determines whether we actually need to do anything with it. Then we've got an extractor agent um, that is using one of these frontier models to extract details about the product. How much, what's the product code, where do we need to ship this? In our example, we're just going to use 3 data points to keep it simple and really focus just on how the mechanics of everything works. And then if we have a completed request, then we can continue to process the order downstream. Now, in our example, we're just going to send out a confirmation email instead of entering into a downstream system, but you could easily plug in an RPA process in there. We'll leverage, if the information is incomplete, we can take information provided by the extractor agent. So understanding what are the missing fields, what clarification questions do we need to ask, and we can pass that information into an RPA process using generative AI activities within UiPath to actually craft the response. So everything's customized to actually what we need to ask and send out that. Then we're going to have a intermediate wait event that watches that mailbox. And one of the key things we'll talk about in the implementation is the importance of the thread ID on the email. So how do we distinguish whether this is a new thread or this is related to an existing Maestro execution? So we'll use an event for watching. We'll rerun it through an AI agent to do a completeness check to say, like, this is what we were missing before. Here's the response provided. Here was the original response. Do we have everything now? If so, give these components out, enter the order. Now we'll continue to loop through this process where we can set sort of an iteration max on it. So if after 4 clarifications, we still can't get to the right answer, this is where we might want to kick it out to a person to, again, jump on a phone call or, ask in a different way to try to get to the results. So we will switch into Maestro now, and I'll kind of walk through how to build it. And then we can take a brief walk through the platform itself. So let me go ahead and reshare my screen here. All right. So this is the Maestro platform. Like I said, we're not going to walk through it right now, but we'll get into the actual building of a process. And then we'll put the pieces together and construct most of it and then take a look at a real life or the actual completed solution and run some executions of it so you guys can see what's working. So we're going to start here by going into the UiPath Studio. So this is their web studio where you can design agents, RPA workflows, API workflows, and then what we would call the agentic processes with Maestro. So we're going to go ahead and click a new one. If you haven't dove into the studio on the web in a while, they're sort of re-architecting how things work. So everything's packaged up now in a solution, which is a combination of the various components that make up that solution. So you have the agentic process, you would have an RPA workflow, you'd have an agent. So you'd have all these different components that are packaged up in the solution. And the Web Studio handles deployment into the orchestrator so that everything runs just fine. So you've got your canvas here in the middle section, and this is where we're gonna pop our events in here, define our triggers. We're not going to use this today for at least the overall agentic process, but they do have an autopilot in here. And so if you've used anything like Claude Code or Cowork, it works very similarly in terms of defining what you want to build. It knows all the capabilities of the UiPath solution, so it can help actually build out the processes. And a lot of times it can get you pretty close to where you're just, you're kind of tweaking and configuring exactly what you want. Now, obviously, when it comes to building out any sort of agentic solution, it's really in testing and making sure that um, your evaluation sets are performing like you want it, because there's nothing worse than putting an agent out there that's not fine-tuned and it's doing all these sorts of things that are providing a bad customer experience. So again, building the automation is one, fine-tuning it is a lot of the work too. So anyways, we'll start with our canvas here. So we've got this start event. We can define what the name is. So we'll just say, customer order email received. And we can now define the action. So we're going to use a connector. So this is a wait for connector. And we'll select the activity. And so again, you can define like custom webhooks if you have it pushing from another system. But in this particular example, we're going to just use the Gmail activities for email received. So we've got one here, email received. There's filters that you can put on here. You can select which inbox. So some people prefer to do some like triage on the emails before they actually come into the Maestro solution. So you can have email rules or another agent that does classification before it actually flows in. So then you don't have to worry about, am I actually dealing with the customer order? There's other filters that you can put in here to say, hey, we only want to look at this particular email domain, or people who are CC'd in here or has a specific subject line, but we're going to hold off on the filter. One of the things, especially when you're using the wait activity in these long-running conversational orchestration processes, that's super important is the thread ID. So if you don't provide Maestro a thread ID as this custom instance ID, what will happen is when you get an email in that's a reply to the original email, it'll treat it as a new Maestro execution. So it won't know anything about what's happened before. So this is a step that a lot of people miss here, is that actually taking the thread ID from the email, so we can see it's in this, the actual email that comes in for the trigger. So we're going to set that to the custom instance ID, and we'll use it again when we're using the wait activity. So if we think about our process, what's next? Okay, so we want to build an agent extractor to be able to say, give me all the information for the order, and then tell me what we're missing and what sort of clarification questions we might need to answer. So before we go ahead and configure everything, I'm just going to add the elements here. So we can click this plus sign and then determine, okay, what do we need to add in next? So this would be an agent, and it's going to be a start and wait agent. So we want to start the agent and wait for an execution to actually occur. In this instance, we're just going to put a placeholder in here before we actually go in and create this. And we're going to call this extract order information. All right, and you can see there's a little warning sign here that just basically says, hey, we haven't actually defined what the agent is, but we'll worry about that later as we continue to as we continue to build out the solution. I'll stop right here real quickly just to make sure. Any questions as we're building this out? Okay. All right, so next step in the path is we want to have some sort of condition that says, do we have all the information that we need? So if we scroll down here, we've got our gateways. So we're going to want to use this exclusive gateway. So we're only going to go down one path. And we're going to call this, call it is order complete. All right, I'm going to move this down a little bit. All right, so we will first develop the yes path. So we'll say we're going to add, if it's completed, we want to do some sort of activity to complete the process. So when we have all the information, it's in a structured format. The next element would be to execute some sort of, deterministic process. So we're going to do this RPA workflow placeholder, and we'll call this one enter order into ERP. And then after we've entered the order in here, we are going to use an end event. And we'll just call this order completed. All right. So that path is fairly simple. We know we have everything. We're going to enter the order. We're going to do what we need to do. The path that's more complex, obviously, and the challenge what we're trying to solve here for is in the instance we don't have enough information. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to send a clarification email to the customer. So we're going to say, we're going to do another RPA workflow here, and we will do a placeholder, and we'll just say send clarification email. After we send the email, this is where we come into our intermediate wait events. So I mentioned there's a couple types of ways that we can do this. And there should be, there's both these timer intermediate events, and then there's this message. So in order to leverage both of these intermediate events, we want to use this event-based gateway. So this is basically saying to us, which of these happens first? Are we going to hit our timer of 3 days, whatever the threshold that we set, or are we going to receive a response from the customer to be able to continue the iteration of the loop? So we're going to add 2 nodes here. First, we'll go with the timer intermediate catch event. And then if we hit this timeout, we're going to go ahead and just put an end in here for now. But this is essentially where we would build like an escalation path into Action Center. So if you're leveraging UiPath as sort of like your task center with Action Center, we would want to create some sort of action so they know, hey, here's all the context of the conversation that we've had this far. We haven't been able to get here with our process flow. So someone needs to take this over, and so we can execute it. All right. So the next path is going to be our wait for communications. So our message event. So we'll define this through the integration services. We'll utilize a connector. Again, we're going to use the Gmail activities for email received. And this is, again, where it's super important to use the thread ID that we got from the initial email. So we're going to say that the thread equals, and we're going to go into this, whoops, order received in the response. So that way, when these watch triggers fire on the email box, we're looking specifically for information that's related to the thread. And because we've told it that this thread is the custom instance ID, it knows to associate the response with the existing instance of the Maestro flow and not start a brand new one. And then this watch trigger knows that, hey, I'm only looking for any sort of responses that have this particular thread ID. So that's, again, super important to make sure that we've added that thread ID. All right. So the next step of the process after we've waited, we've got the response back. Now we want to leverage another agent. So this agent's going to reevaluate the situation and say, hey, I've got enough information here to process this, or I still need to loop back through and ask for clarification. So, sorry, we will name this check order completion. All right. If it is complete, we want to route it to completed, or we want to route it to this is order completed state, so then we can iterate through the loop. But another thing we talked about is there's not only this time execution or time elapse where we want to decide, hey, are we going to continue to do this, or are we going to kick this out to someone, but we also want to incorporate some sort of max iterations. So we'll have a variable that we can set up throughout the process. So there's this data manager tab here. We can set up a variable that's process iterations. And we'll set this as an integer and start at 0. So as we've executed this task, we can say that we want to add something in here to increment the counter. And then we will route to orders completed. Just clean this up here a bit. All right. So we've got the basic premise of our flow built. Again, order comes in, check for information. Is it completed? If it's not, send clarification, wait for either 3 days to elapse or the reply to come in, check again for order completion, iterate our counter, and then loop through this again. Is our order completed now? If not, go through the process. Hopefully by the first iteration, we'll have all the clarifications that we need, and we'll be able to enter this into the ERP. But at this point, our order is completed. So we won't go through the setup of each of the individual components, but I did want to show you just the setup of at least one of the agents, and just how we can use the autopilot tool within UiPath to build these solutions out. So if we go in here, we are going to, since there's no existing agent that we're going to assign this, we're going to click Add Resource. And this is where we talked about the solutions that are built. So you've got your agentic process, and then you've got this new agent here that we can rename to, extract order information. So there's several different types of agents that you can leverage within any of your solutions. There's the conversational agents that are more for like real-time dialogue if you have your user right there. A lot of these processes aren't dealing with that because we're trying to get information. There's unknown delays between the process, so that we're not going to particularly use that in here. There's coded agents. So these are agents that you can build outside of UiPath. So if you're building something in Python and it's hosted on as an Azure Function app or container, you can also incorporate these so that you still get the same like auditability across the entirety of the process. So you can import those into the studio. But today we're going to create what's called the UiPath native autonomous agents. So you have two options. You can either generate with autopilot or you can start fresh. But we're just going to go ahead and describe the scenario that we have, what we need, what information we can use. So we're going to say we receive an email subject, let's just say subject and body from a customer. We need to extract order information, including item code, delivery address, and quantity. We also need to assess if all the information is present. So please out. All right, so something like that just describes at a very high level, what are we looking for? What are we going to give it? What are we expecting it to do? How does it work? So it will open up this agent flow here. So there's a lot of different like extensions off of the core agent that we're not going to be using. But again, you can see the autopilot's starting to work. So it's understanding what we're doing. It's processing it, building out a game plan. It might ask you some questions in the process to say, hey, is this what you're trying to do? Do I need more information? Stuff like that. So we'll kind of monitor that as things go on. But just to kind of explain what's in here. So you've got your core agent that provides, okay, what model do you want to use? There's a ton of out-of-the-box models provided by UiPath. You can also bring your own model through the AI trust layer. You can set up any of the models that you want. There's a pretty easy configuration to do that. For this, we're just going to use GPT-4. There's a system prompt, a user prompt in both of these that you can inject variables into. So obviously the user prompt is going to be specific to the instance that we're working on. There's model settings. So like how precise or creative do we want the agent to be? In this particular instance, because we're asking for like a deterministic output, we want it to be fairly precise in how it goes through it. You can restrict tokens in the response, but as we're setting it up and telling it exactly what we want, there's there's things in here that it's going to be pretty restricted to how much it's going to actually output. You can also add guardrails in here for different things like PII detection, so making sure that doesn't go to the models, prompt injection, intellectual property, all these kinds of stuff. So they really have built a really comprehensive platform from a compliance and security perspective, because I think that's one of the concerns that a lot of people have is how do we safely use AI within the organization? Since it's kind of a black box, how do we make sure that we're not doing something that we don't want to do? So a lot of these guardrails are helpful in the process. So if we look over here, we can see that the autopilot agent has a question for us. It wants us to basically verify information in terms of, okay, what does the input data that we're going to get look like? So that when we're wiring up this to the actual, the full agentic process, what are we going to pass in? What are we going to have? So they're asking the input schema first, then asking the output schema, and then it'll start building the information. So one thing, we're not going to use this in here too, but we talked about, so there's context and tools. So adding tools would be like, if you have access to other MCP servers, if it's an RPA workflow that returns data, it could be IXP for extraction of information. You could also tie it to any other MCP servers you might be using. So for instance, if you use NetSuite as your ERP and you want to reconcile product codes against NetSuite, you can plug in the NetSuite MCP to be able to exchange information and context between those tools. You could also incorporate context grounding. So these could be, free-form text, knowledge bases, documents that you want the agent to reference and incorporate into its information, as well as the core information provided by the frontier model that you might be using. So this is that they make it super easy in how you can index the information within the storage buckets right here in UiPath. You don't have to use a second party or a third party service in order to be able to, provide this information. So there's a lot of bolt-ons that you can add to the agent to make it more powerful as you're trying to process some of these things. Cool. All right, so we can see as it's locked in the schemas, now it's kind of updating the information. So you can see everything that's gone in here. This is our system prompt. So it's telling it, hey, here's your role, here's your tools, here's the basic work steps that you need to do, and output rules. And then, let's see, I think it's asking us to accept. And then it's also created here a user prompt. So it's saying, here's the information that you're going to take in. So system prompt, if you're unfamiliar with agents, is more like the overarching instructions for the agent and what's it supposed to execute, whereas the user prompt is the specific instance of this execution and what are the pieces of information that it has, and how it should actually execute all this. So we'll go ahead and accept both. And so once the autopilot's completed, it's going to kind of tell you an overall summary of what it built for you. So it defines your input schema, all the things that it needs and the information it needs to execute, what it's going to output, as well as the logic of the agent. So it'll follow up with some additional things that it thinks maybe you should do, add to the agent. But at this point, you've got a functioning agent that you can begin testing. So there's a whole different set of tools that you can use for evaluation sets. This is super important when building out your agents, is providing it robust evaluation sets with lots of different types of situations that it could encounter so that you can evaluate the model or the prompts to make sure that they're complete. They're not doing things that they're not supposed to be doing. So there's a whole series of information, and I think we'll probably highlight that and do a deep dive at a later session, but really great tools in terms of how to build out agents, um, how to work with them, and how to make sure that they're functioning. So at this point, we'll go ahead and pop back into the agentic process. Now, when you're building your solution, you want to rename these components so you can say, hey, this is my um, extraction agent. We'll just call this our, oops. We'll call this our order entry agentic process. All right. I'll stop here real quick. I know that's a lot of information, obviously. Any questions with how we set up the agent, anything that we've done to set up the process flow within the studio at this point?
John, the only thing that I'll mention is obviously you make it look pretty easy when you're building out a simple workflow.
Yeah.
When you're looking at production grade end-to-end processes, typically there's many different scenarios that need to be accounted for, and so that's where I think a company like Welcomely does a really good job at defining those on the front end, so that way we can build the most elaborate, best fit solution based off your business needs. So no, I think showing it in a live studio environment is good for people to see kind of how you orchestrate it and design it. But ultimately, I think there's a little bit of consulting on the front end to define those scenarios and work with our clients.
Yep. Yep. Totally agree. And a lot of that comes into play, when we talk about the evaluation sets that you build for agents and stuff, a lot of that's the part of the upfront work, is understanding the types of responses, the scenarios that you need to make sure that you're handling, so that A, you're providing like an excellent customer experience, and then B, that like things don't go off the rails. So yeah, totally agree. A lot of work goes into behind, or into and around building these solutions beyond just sort of slapping the logic into the process flow. So we'll kind of we'll connect one of the components just to show you what it would look like, and then we'll dive into the completed solution, and then we'll go ahead and run the test. So what I want you guys to see is, how does the actual iterations run? What are the mechanics of it? See the actual inputs, outputs of it as we go through the process, and then kind of see some of the analytics that are provided by the Maestro platform. So in here, we set up these placeholder agents. it's actually already connected our extraction agent in here. So it said, hey, this is the one that we want to run. It's telling you, hey, I need a email subject and body. So we can determine where we pass that information in. So that's coming from the, customer order email received. So this would be in the response object. You would see our body. Whoops, put it in the wrong one, but we're not going to run this. So let's see, subject. So we pop in the subject there. And then it's already went ahead and set up our output. So we have item code, delivery address, quantity, is complete, clarification questions, and then also if there's any errors that occur. So again, we could put in specific error handling, error retry policies around this to make sure, again, it's a really robust solution that doesn't have gaps where things would just kind of stall out. Yeah, that's connecting everything together, defining inputs, outputs, then all the magic sort of happens within the agent itself in terms of using the LLM, the prompts provided to get the information that we need out. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into a completed solution here. So let me get that set up real quick. All right. So this is our completed conversational agent. If we look here in the different components to this, so we've got the agentic process itself, we've got a send follow-up email RPA flow, we've got order extraction and an order completeness test. Now you could combine those two agents and have one that just kind of checks order completeness in one single agent. But we've just set it up slightly different. So we've got our, if we walk through the process here, we've got monitoring our order mailbox that's set to our Gmail inbox. We've assigned our thread ID. We're extracting order information and then testing completeness. We're checking to see if we've hit the iteration count so that we can sort of short circuit it if we've already, had 5 back and forth conversations with the customer. We have our incrementation of the counter to make sure that that properly hits that threshold. We send out our clarification email, and so we're just using a standard RPA workflow here. So if we can take a look at this real quick. So we're using the Gen AI activities within UiPath with this content generation. There's some things in here that we're making sure that we're replying to the proper email. So we don't want to just create a new email. We want to actually reply to the existing thread. So there's some things to get that thread ID in here. And then we're reevaluating and looping through. And then finally, we're just sending an order confirmation instead of actually going through and entering it into an ERP system. So we'll go ahead and simulate one of these so you guys can see what actually happens. So we'll go ahead and send an email. Say, so we'll try to be intentionally vague here. Okay, so we'll go ahead and fire off the email here. We'll go ahead and step into the Maestro platform to kind of see what that looks like while we kind of wait. So we've got what we see here as process instances. So this breaks down both of our or any processes that you might have deployed as a solution. So we can dive into this. the conversational agentic process. So one thing we can look at is the start trigger activity. So this is all the times that it's reached out and said, hey, is there something that I need to be working on? And then you can see if there's, how many events were fetched and then how many of those events actually matched the criteria that we were looking at. So we've set up this particular connection to run on a 1-minute interval. So you can see it actually did match an event. So hopefully when we go back into our process instances, we'll see a new execution, which we can see here. So if we click into this, we can see where it is at in the process. So we've received the email. It's now executing information. It's determining that we don't have the proper information. So we routed to the path where we need to ask follow-up questions. We didn't hit an iteration count yet, so we're continuing on to actually sending out the communication. As we go throughout the process, you can see each step. So if you wanted to click like send clarification email, you can see the variables within this. So we passed in, here's the email address, here's the missing fields. It's saying, hey, I don't have the delivery address, so this is what I need you to ask questions about. You can see that we've hit the reply portion of it. So it's waiting for a reply here. Just like the trigger, we can see like the traces of all the times that it's actually checked for the event. So it actually hasn't gone out and checked for a response yet. But this is where we would need to go in and reply. So now we can see in our replying to our initial response, we can see, hey, we need more information. Can you send us your delivery address for this? So we'll say, sure thing. Awesome. So let's go back to our instance management. We can see we're still at the wait for reply. And so we'll wait for it to pull that. As we wait on it to actually pull the response, let me show you some of the monitoring tools that are available in the platform. So I think this is really cool because it's evaluating the process and kind of showing bottlenecks. So we can see up here in the process map here, it's showing like how essentially by overlaying this heat map, where is the most, we'll say quote unquote, friction in the process. And so as you would expect, it's in the reply. So everything else runs fairly autonomously, and there's not a lot of things that occur in that. There's actually a breakdown into the elements and how long each duration is, if there's any sort of outliers for that duration. So any deviations from that, we could look in and say, hey, this looks like it's an issue. Something happened here. You need to look into it. So it's kind of that process mining view of the process as it's actually executing and running. So let's pop back in. All right. So we can see this latest iteration. We did receive the email back. And then we evaluated, again, the address. And so we can see we extracted this address from here. You can see it did some structuring to it. So there's one thing, this is kind of a sidebar that when we use agents to extract, here's an example of a tool that you might want to use. So if you're using addresses, incorporate an address validation tool via Google APIs. So you can make sure it's a valid address, but then get it into something that's hyperstructured that you need. But then we can see it evaluated to true at that point. So then it would go to the completed step of actually sending out the email and then saying we're completed. So then if we go back in to our mailbox, we can see, your order's been placed, expect delivery in 1 to 2 weeks. Here's the part number, delivery address, and quantity that you asked for. So if we go back in to our monitoring tool, we can see now everything, all the metrics are updated. We can see that there's 3 iterations or 3 instances of the process, 3 completed successfully. But at any time, you can see what's going on, what's in a running state, what's in a pause state, anything that might have faulted. So it gives you that view across processes. So like if you think about how we would construct these highly complex solutions, we might break them in the RPA traditional sense, we might break them up into components and pass things between queues, which makes it very difficult to report against, but then also see like everything that's going on. So that kind of completes our demo of the solution, how we would build out a process, the different things that we think about, how we wire the different components together to really make a holistic solution. So I'll pause for questions, and then we'll just kind of dive into one last slide before we go ahead and shut down for today. So any questions about what you saw?
John, one question from the audience is could you instrument this using just pure RPA, like traditional RPA? I guess, like, how does Maestro open up the complexity of solutions that you can automate?
Yeah, so I think it's really layering the pieces together, right? So when it comes to building complex end-to-end solutions that might transpire over, days, weeks, it's really opening up, piecing everything together so that you don't lose visibility and connectivity throughout that process. So if you think about building out this process without the Maestro layer on top of it, we would have, a trigger that's monitoring an email box that then once it gets something, it would hand it off to an agent, which the agent would extract information and then pass it into a queue item. Then that queue item then would trigger another process to say, hey, do we have enough information? If not, send an email. So you kind of get it, like all these components would be individual components within the platform still, and you could execute everything. So it could still be a desktop RPA automation. It could be an API workflow. It could be a studio workflow, or web studio workflow. So you could still have all these individual components, but what you really lose is the ability to see exactly what's going on in the process in a single pane of glass. So you would constantly have to like check for new emails. You wouldn't know how long to do that before it's escalating. It just brings everything together, gives you that observability, auditability, and everything is kind of tied up in one neat little box.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think, for the attendees on the call today, you're probably familiar with Welcomely's design and how we build solutions, but most solutions follow the dispatcher performer model. And so again, just kind of layering on to what John said, if we were to build this without Maestro, I think what we would do is probably have like 3 different dispatchers, basically like 5 or 6 processes that operate independently. Sure, the one triggers the next one, but in terms of having holistic, auditability and reporting on where the gaps are, how long does it take to reach from this step to this step, that's very hard to do, right? You have to, and I'll say this from personal experience, but you'd have to download the job logs for each process, analyze the data, and then make sense of it from a holistic standpoint. And that takes time and effort, right? So again, that's where I think Maestro is pretty game changing, is for these long running complex workflows that might require human in the loop. It doesn't even have to be human validation, right? Like maybe it's a new client onboarding and you're waiting for that client to submit the information that you need. That could be 1 day or 2 weeks, but instrumenting it where the workflow and process knows exactly what to do and when. That's always been troublesome if you're just looking at it per process, right? Not orchestrating it with Maestro. So cool.
Yep.
I think that's all the questions we have for today, John.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll just, I mean, we addressed a lot of this information, but I can just pop into this last slide here. And it's just kind of talking about, okay, um, how do you spot this like Maestro-sized problem or shaped problem within your organization? Um, and then, kind of what do you do about it? So let me share my screen here again. So again, it's the kind of common questions that we want to ask. And really, if you're answering yes to 2 or 3 of these, it's an ideal situation for Maestro, specifically as it relates to these conversational flows. So A, does it span one or more system or actor? So are you using bots, agents, human in the loop, external automations, applications? If you see any of those things happening or it's interchanging between departments, it's a very good indicator that it's this sort of Maestro-shaped problem. Second being, do you have to wait? Does it have a wait in there? Is it for approval or communications with customers, clients, internal folks, whatever it is? These specific problems, and this is again why we wanted to highlight specifically these conversational orchestration problems, is because they're so pervasive in organizations and they slow things down. They, take people away from the things that they could be focusing on and doing a lot more efficiently, and they're just really inconvenient. And then lastly is having this, and I think this goes to like what Justin was talking about towards the end, is like the advantage of Maestro is having this clean audit trail of what happened from the initial interaction to the ultimate resolution of this particular interaction, conversation, instance, whatever you want to call it. So having this clean view, these awesome reporting tools with that. So if you're saying yes to 2 or 3 of these, it's definitely a clean opportunity for sort of the Maestro solution. So I think what we're kind of like asking everyone here to do today is think about those challenges that you have in your organization, whether it's your specific department or if you're looking at the business holistically. Is there anything that you see as one of these Maestro-shaped problems? Second is starting to build out, what does this look like from a, if you don't use the specific BPM and structure, but just an outline of what are all the decision points? What are all the actions that are in the process, and where are we spending time? Where is it, where is the friction within this process, so that you have an idea of what the end-to-end looks like? And then identifying where we could, and this is really where we could help. And if you're interested in sitting down with anyone from our team to kind of discuss your challenge, is start taking, how would we scaffold out a solution for this? Where would we plug in an agent versus where might you need a human in the loop element? How would we build an RPA workflow to accomplish this deterministic task? So we can sort of layer on the different components and design a solution that would really bring it all together. And then last steps is obviously we help build out these solutions for clients. So whether it was a quicker pilot with a small process to kind of test it out, and then sort of fully productionize something as we sort of investigate all the different workflows within a solution. So that kind of wraps up our session today. I'll kind of ask one more time if anyone has any questions before we go.
Now I'll just take it a step further, John. So Welcomely has prepared kind of, based off the attendees, their industries, their companies, the KPIs that matter to them, a quick high-level assessment of where there is Maestro opportunities. So if you don't know, we want to help provide that first step. So we'll be sending that out afterwards in a one-pager, and happy to set up additional time, like Jonathan mentioned, if we want to explore that with our consulting team. No other questions for today, John.
Awesome. Well, again, I appreciate the time for everyone. I appreciate that everyone is looking to learn new capabilities and skills. And again, this is going to be part of a broader series that we will do that really frames the different capabilities and how we can solve specific types of problems and challenges within organizations with the UiPath platform. So again, thanks everyone for attending, and look forward to having conversations at a later point.